After tragedy drives a former emergency responder into solitude with his young daughter, their quiet life is upended when he rescues a mysterious woman in a snowstorm. Unaware she's a billionaire on a run from betrayal and danger. If you like the stories about unconditional kindness, love, and second chances, please subscribe. There are more to follow. The snow had begun to fall before dawn, soft, hushed, like ash from a distant fire. It gathered on the old wooden shingles of the cabin roof, nestled into the corners of the window panes, and crept over the path Jack Crawford had carved the day before. Inside, the fire had gone low, but the coals still pulsed like a memory refusing to die. Jack stirred with the iron poker, not because it needed it, but because his hands didn't know what to do when they weren't holding grief. He didn't speak much these days. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, 1 stove, and silence thick enough to hear thoughts echo. It sat far enough from the nearest town to feel forgotten, but close enough for a radio to catch weather reports if the wind allowed. That morning, it didn't. Behind him, a soft yawn. The tiny creak of a mattress spring. Then bare feet padding across wooden floors. "Morning, Daddy." Jack turned. His daughter, Liliana, 8, barefoot, hair a mess of sleepy tangles, hugged herself against the cold. He smiled gently. "You forgot your socks." She nodded solemnly, then sat cross-legged near the fire and held her palms out to it like a priestess before a quiet altar. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. There were things they both understood without ever naming them. There was a photograph on the shelf. Not framed, just tucked behind a mug. Jack, a woman with starlight in her eyes, and baby Liliana swaddled in yellow. The edges had curled over time, and one corner had a coffee stain. Her name had been Rachel. Jack hadn't said it aloud in 2 years. He had been an emergency responder once. Quick, precise, always the first through fire and flood. He knew every back road by heart, every stretch of forest where a body might be found, every sound grief could make. But he hadn't made it in time. He could still feel the weight of the headset on his ears. The dispatcher's voice, the exact second his own name had echoed back to him through the static, like fate had pointed a finger. He had driven like hell, but hell had already arrived. Now, the mornings were rituals. They chopped wood together. Liliana insisted on carrying the smaller logs, and Jack never stopped her, even when she stumbled. He taught her how to check the sky, how to read the frost on tree bark, how to listen for the far-off hush of snowfall before it arrived. He didn't call it survival. He just called it living. Liliana had a blue knit hat with a pom-pom that bounced when she walked. Rachel had made it. She wore it every day. One evening, while the snow whispered against the windows, Liliana laid out the old Monopoly board. Some of the money was missing. The thimble piece had been lost in the floorboards last winter, so they used a pine cone instead. They played by lamplight, their laughter small but real. "Do you miss Mommy?" she asked once, not looking up. Jack didn't answer right away. He reached for a log and fed it to the fire, watching the sparks lift like stars trying to get home. "Every day," he said. That was enough. She leaned against him, and he let her small head fit just beneath his chin. The storm came without warning. Wind bent the pine trees into aching shapes, and snow spun sideways in furious circles. Jack sealed the windows with old quilts, stoked the fire to near roaring, and counted the jars of beans and dried apples in the cupboard. They'd be fine. They always were. It was just past dusk when he heard it, a sound not made by the forest, not wind, not branches, a thud, heavy, sudden, as if someone had fallen. He grabbed the flashlight. Liliana clutched his sleeve. "Stay here," he said gently. She didn't cry. She just nodded, then wrapped herself in a blanket on the floor by the fire, eyes wide and unblinking. Jack stepped out into the storm. The snow was knee-deep and biting. The flashlight beam caught wild, tumbling flakes, each one a tiny blade of light. He followed the sound, every instinct alert. Then he saw her, a shape in white, half buried in a drift, her coat shredded, hair frozen to her cheeks. One arm was twisted beneath her, the other stretched out like she had reached for something she never found. He dropped to his knees. "Ma'am." His voice cracked the stillness. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer. He checked her pulse. Weak, but there. She was alive. He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than she looked, cold, limp, and dressed like someone who hadn't planned for this kind of weather. Helicopter crash. Maybe. Plane off course. He didn't ask questions. Jack just carried her home. Liliana watched with wide eyes as he laid the woman on the cot. She was pale, lips blue, lashes crusted with frost. Is she dead? No, Jack said, but she's close. He lit the lantern, boiled water, and laid his warmest blanket over her. Liliana brought her favorite stuffed animal and tucked it beside the woman's arm. She looks like a princess. Jack didn't disagree. Hours passed. Jack sat beside her, checking her pulse, brushing ice from her brow, waiting. Every so often, he whispered something he didn't remember later. Just before dawn, she stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, gray, storm-worn, intelligent. They flickered across the room, the fire, Jack's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came. You're safe, he said quietly. She tried to sit up, winced, and stopped. You fell, he continued, in the storm. I found you. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. Liliana peeked from behind the wood stove. The woman turned toward her, confused but gentle. Jack noticed her looking. My daughter, he said. Liliana. The woman blinked slowly. Then, with a voice like snow melting on stone, she murmured, Elise. Jack nodded once. No surprise in his eyes. I'm Jack. They didn't talk much that first day. Jack made stew. Elise only picked at it. He gave her a dry sweater, 2 sizes too big. She wore it like armor. That night, when the wind howled loud enough to rattle the walls, she trembled. He didn't ask why. He just added another log to fire and left the door to her room open, just a little. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The snow kept falling for 3 more days. In that time, Elise began to move slowly around the cabin. She had bruises, a sprained wrist, but more than that, something haunted her. Not fear, not quite, more like the ghost of betrayal. Jack recognized it. Some silences you don't fill. You just sit beside them until they shrink enough to breathe. Liliana brought Elise a pine cone once. She had painted it gold with melted crayon wax. It's magic, she explained solemnly. For luck. Elise smiled. A real one. On the 4th morning, Elise stood at the window watching the snow melt in slow beads from the roof's edge. Jack poured coffee, the kind that tastes like smoke and old stories. You live alone out here? She asked. Jack nodded. It's quiet. She studied him. That why you chose it? No, he said. That's why I stayed. He didn't explain. She didn't push. That evening, Jack found Elise reading one of Liliana's storybooks by the fire, her legs tucked under her hair still slightly damp from a boiled bucket bath. She looked tired and, maybe for the first time, safe. Liliana had fallen asleep beside her. A little snowflake charm bracelet dangled from her wrist. Elise had given it to her after dinner, wordlessly, like a peace offering. Jack leaned against the doorway. You're good with her, he said. I don't know children. You didn't have to. You just listened. That made Elise look up. Something passed through her eyes. Something old. Something hurt. I used to trust people, she said. Jack looked at the fire, then back to her. Maybe you still do. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moon rose slow over the trees, casting long shadows that didn't move. Inside, the warmth held steady. The fire cracked once, then settled. Elise closed her eyes, just for a moment, and breathed in the silence. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet life, was the beginning of everything. Snow still lingered like breath held too long. It clung to the branches in soft clumps and crusted the path outside the cabin like forgotten sugar. The world beyond remained quiet, muted, almost reverent, as though honoring some unspoken promise. Inside, the fire hummed low. The woman Jack had rescued, Elise, sat near it now, swaddled in wool and silence. She had not asked where she was. Not really. And Jack hadn't offered more than she needed. They were 2 people who understood that some truths come only when they're ready to be spoken. Liliana had started calling her Miss Elise, always with that small smile, the one that sneaked into your chest when you weren't looking. Elise never corrected her. She moved slowly those first few days, not just from injury, though her body still carried bruises in the shape of impact and betrayal, but also from something older, heavier, like she'd been holding her breath for years and still wasn't sure the air here was safe. She watched the snow fall with wary eyes, like it might decide to turn violent again. She watched Jack even more quietly. There was a gentleness in how he moved. Every motion was deliberate, quiet, like someone used to listening for cries beneath rubble. Even the way he poured tea felt like an apology, to time, to memory, to the things he could not save. One evening, she reached for her cup and her sleeve slipped back. The faint shimmer of a scar, long and pale, ran along her forearm. Jack didn't ask, just handed her the tea and went back to fixing the door hinge that creaked in the wind. Elise noticed that too. She noticed everything. In the dim hours of morning, Jack would teach Liliana how to sharpen sticks for kindling or tie knots just in case. Elise would watch them from the window, her hands wrapped around a mug she never really drank from. Liliana would sometimes wave at her through the frost-dusted glass, and Elise, without meaning to, would wave back. It became their ritual. One night, after Liliana had gone to sleep curled up with her pine cone talisman and her dreams, Elise sat across from Jack at the kitchen table. The fire cast soft shadows on the walls, making the cabin look larger than it was. Like maybe it held more than just wood and stone. Like maybe it held room for healing, too. "I wasn't supposed to survive," Elise said, her voice low. Jack didn't flinch, just waited. "I had people I trusted. I thought I could still fix what my father built. But greed doesn't know loyalty." She didn't cry. Not really. But her voice cracked on the word father, and that was more than enough. Jack's hand rested on the table. Open, still, not reaching, not asking. Just there. She looked at it, and then looked away. Her father had been a builder, not just of homes, but of belief. He'd taught her the names of trees, how to find true north without a compass, how to shake a man's hand without blinking. He had called her little iron, not because she was unbreakable, but because even soft metal could be reforged. When he died, his oldest friends turned cold. They whispered about her behind glass doors, made moves behind closed ones. Still, she had fought, until someone she trusted with everything sold her for the price of silence. And she fell from the sky into snow, fire, and smoke. Now she sat by firelight, wrapped in a sweater 2 sizes too big, beside a man who didn't press and a child who offered her bracelets made of yarn and trust. It was the strangest peace she had ever known. One morning, Elise woke to laughter. Real, uninhibited laughter. The kind that made you stop and listen, because it didn't sound like it belonged to a place that had known sorrow. She followed the sound outside. Jack had rigged a sled out an old plank and 2 iron runners. Liliana was riding it down a small slope, squealing with joy, cheeks pink with cold. Elise watched them. Watched him. There was a quiet strength in the way he knelt to help his daughter back on her feet. A tenderness she hadn't known men were still allowed to show. He looked up and caught Elise watching. "You ever been sledding?" he called out. She shook her head. "Not since I was 10. Jack offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it. The slope wasn't steep, but her breath caught anyway. Not from fear, but from something else. Something she didn't want to name. The sled hit the bottom, snow spraying into her lap, and for a moment, just a moment, she forgot she was supposed to be looking over her shoulder. That night, Liliana crawled into Elise's lap with a piece of paper folded into fourths. "I made you something." Elise opened it. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures, one tall with long black scribble of hair, one bearded with square shoulders, and one small in a big hat. She looked at it for a long time, then hugged Liliana a little too tightly. Later, after the child had fallen asleep with her drawing tucked beneath her pillow, Elise sat outside on the steps. Snow was falling again, soft, reluctant, like it didn't want to interrupt anything. Jack joined her, without a word. After a while, she asked, "You ever think about going back?" "To what?" He wasn't being coy. to the world. Lights, noise, people. Jack breathed into his hands. Used to. Then I realized the world I miss might not be out there anymore. She nodded slowly. I understand that. And she did, more than he knew. The next day, Elise helped Liliana thread pine needles into a necklace. She fumbled. Liliana giggled. "You're not very good at this," the child said, without malice. "I've had other things to do," Elise replied. "Like what?" Elise paused, then smiled. "Like forget what matters." That night, Liliana asked if Elise would tell a bedtime story. "I don't know any good ones," she said. "Then tell a real one." So Elise did. She told her about a girl who grew up in cities made of glass, whose father taught her how to build real homes. Homes where people felt safe. She told of men with shiny suits who smiled with teeth but no heart, and how one day the girl stopped listening to them. She didn't say how it ended, because maybe it hadn't yet. When she looked down, Liliana was asleep, her hand curled gently into Elise's sweater. Elise stayed up that night, watching the fire fade. She pulled a worn business card from her coat pocket, the logo scratched, the name barely legible. The last thing she had from that world. She held it over the flame, but didn't drop it. Not yet. When Jack passed by her chair before bed, he paused. "Sometimes," he said, "we keep broken things not because we need them," he looked at the card, "but because we haven't decided what to grow in their place." He didn't wait for her response, just walked away. Elise sat there a long while. Then slowly, gently, she tore the card in two and placed the pieces in the fire. The flames welcomed them without question. The next morning, when Liliana called her name, Miss Elise, she answered it without hesitation. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was pretending to be someone else. She felt found. The snow began to melt, just barely. Icicles loosened their grip on the roof's edge, dripping in slow, rhythmic beats like a clock hesitating between heartbeats. Days grew longer, if only by minutes. But in the quiet clearing where the cabin stood, time moved differently. Elise had begun leaving her coat unbuttoned. That said enough. Jack built a bench outside, just under the old pine where the wind always whispered. It wasn't fancy, just cedar and care. Liliana called it the watching seat. Elise sat there often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Liliana curled at her side, explaining cloud shapes and inventing names for the birds that visited. Sometimes Jack joined, saying nothing, only sipping coffee from the chipped mug Elise had once glued back together without telling anyone. It became another kind of ritual. 3 people, no longer strangers. Not quite a family, but not far from it either. One morning, Elise braided Liliana's hair without being asked. She'd watched Jack do it before, clumsy, crooked braids made with the kind of love that didn't mind imperfection. Elise's fingers, once used for signing contracts and sketching blueprints, found rhythm in the softness of a child's hair. "You're better at this than Dad," Liliana said. Elise smiled, almost bashful. "I've had practice," she whispered. She didn't explain further, and Liliana didn't ask. Inside the cabin, a new warmth had settled, not from the hearth, though that still glowed every evening, but from the quiet comfort patterns shared between people who'd stopped waiting to be left. Elise began cooking again. Not much, but enough. A soup Jack said tasted like something his mother once made. Elise didn't tell him it was from a memory. 2. A rainy afternoon at Marseille with her father, after they closed their first deal on foreign soil. She hadn't tasted it since. Now it tasted like here. Jack had found an old chest set buried in the attic crawl space. Elise wiped the dust on the pieces like they mattered, each one carefully unwrapped like an artifact. They played slowly. Jack wasn't very good. Elise pretended not to be. They didn't talk much during games, but something shifted each time a pawn crossed the board. Trust, perhaps, or something like it. Liliana watched with the intensity only children possess. One night, she asked Elise why the queen could move anywhere. Elise hesitated, then said, because she had to learn how to do everything when no one else would. The room went very still. Liliana brought her sketch to the dinner table one evening. The family of stick figures had changed. Now they were standing under a crooked pine tree, all three, holding hands. Elise folded the paper into her coat pocket that night. It stayed there for days. One afternoon, the wind changed. Not the kind you hear with your ears, but the kind your body feels first. Jack noticed in the trees. Elise felt it in the silence between firewood cracks. Even Liliana seemed more still than usual, her drawings forgotten as she stared out the window. Sometimes peace has a shape, and sometimes it has a shadow. It began with a sound. Not loud, but foreign. A mechanical whir in the distance. Too steady to be nature, too early for spring travelers. Jack stood from the bench first. His eyes narrowed, a soldier waking in the body of father. Elise joined him, silent as breath. A black drone hovered above the tree line, paused, then vanished. She knew, not by logic, not by reason, but by the sinking pull in her gut that told her they'd found her. That night, Elise stood in front of the mirror. She pulled out a small tin from her bag. Inside, a pin, gold with a letter etched into its surface. A gift from her father when she became CEO. To remind you, he had said, that everything begins with you. She pinned it to her shirt. Then she took it off and placed it gently in the drawer by the bedside. She no longer needed a symbol to remember who she was. She found Jack outside chopping wood. "They know I'm here," she said, voice steady but soft. He didn't stop, just split one more log, then looked at her. "I figured it might come to that." Elise stepped closer. The snow beneath her boots crunched softly. "I'm sorry." Jack wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Don't be." She looked at him then. Really looked. The weather in his eyes. The grief that had once tried to swallow him whole. The quiet strength he carried not like armor, but like a second skin. "You don't even know who I am." He leaned the axe against the stump. "I know who you are here." It was all she needed. It was more than anyone had ever given her. That evening, Liliana handed Elise a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, spelled in clumsy but careful handwriting. "Dear Miss Elise, I like when you make soup and smile. If you want to stay here forever, I would like that. Love, Lily. P.S. You can use my pine cone if you're scared." Elise cried then, but not like before. Not from pain. From grace. The night before the storm, Elise knelt by Liliana's bed. Jack stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely, as if unsure whether protect or pray. Elise brushed Liliana's hair back. "If something ever happens, I want you to remember this. Home isn't a place. It's people who stay when they could have left." Liliana blinked sleepily. "Are you leaving?" Elise paused, then shook her head. "Not if I can help it." Liliana curled into her side. Jack didn't say a word, but when Elise stood, he offered her his old flannel, warm, faded, stitched at the shoulder where Liliana had tried to fix it with magic thread. She wore it to sleep. At sunrise, the sky was a strange pale blue, the kind that seemed to hold its breath. Elise stood outside, the wind lifting her hair. Jack walked up beside her. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she said, then smiled. "But I'm not afraid anymore." Inside the cabin, Liliana poured cereal into a chip bowl, singing softly to her pine cone. The fire crackled in rhythm. The walls didn't shake. The roof didn't moan. It was still, for now, a peace wrapped in frost and the weight of things unsaid. But everyone felt it. The world was knocking again. And this time they would answer together. The snow fell again the morning they came. Not the gentle kind that hushes the earth into peace, but the thick, determined kind, carried by wind that felt like warning. It softened everything but the tension in Jack's jaw, the way his hand lingered near the latch of the rifle cabinet. He hadn't touched it in years. Not since that night. The one he never talked about. The one that took her. Liliana sat on the floor by the hearth, carefully lining up pine cones as if they were soldiers in a tiny army. Elise knelt beside her, quiet, braiding her hair with steady fingers, each twist slower than the last, as though trying to stretch time like wool in winter. "Elise," Jack said, voice low. She looked up. "They're here." They came in black, vehicles without plates, tires whispering over snow like ghosts. 3 men stepped out. Not loud, not clumsy. Men who had done this before. Jack stood on the porch, sleeves rolled, heart steady. Elise stepped beside him. She was still wearing the flannel. Still smelled like cedar and firelight, and something stubbornly unafraid. The lead man smiled too easily. Elise Varner. Jack turned to her, slowly. Varner. Not the name she'd given. She met his eyes, and said simply, "Yes." "I'm not going back," Elise said, arms loose at her sides. "You don't have a choice," the man replied. "The board made its decision. You've been declared incapacitated. Your company is not who I am," she said. "Not anymore." Behind her, the cabin door creaked. Liliana watched through a crack in the wood, tiny fingers clutching her pine cone like it could ward off giants. Jack stepped forward then. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lift the old shotgun resting in his arms like a memory, but he stood taller. "She stays." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of grief, of love, of the kind of resolve that doesn't come from rage, but from having already lost too much. They didn't fight in the way movies show. No punches thrown. No bullets fired. Just words. Firm ones. Backed by truth. Backed by pain lived and peace earned. The men didn't need to be told they wouldn't get through. They saw it in Jack's eyes. In the way Elise didn't flinch. They left in silence. Snow covering their tracks as quickly as they'd made them. Later, Elise sat on the edge of the bed, holding the gold pin again. The etched into it seemed smaller now, almost delicate. Jack leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like someone memorizing a sunset he knows won't come again. "I should have told you sooner," she said. He shrugged. "You told me when it mattered." She smiled. The pin stayed on the nightstand. It would never be worn again. Spring came, quiet and slow. It arrived in the form of a single robin on the porch rail, then in the thawing creek that ran beside the cabin, then in Liliana's giggles as she ran barefoot through grass still brave enough to bloom. Elise began to write letters, not to men who tried to steal her life, but to the people who helped build it, her father's oldest friends, the ones who still remembered honor. She wrote one letter each morning by hand at the kitchen table, folded them with care, tied them with string, left them in a wooden box Jack carved just for that. One day, she read one aloud. To Jack, to Liliana, to the ghosts they all carried. "Dear Father," it began, "I thought I had to become steel to protect what we built. But I was wrong. I only needed to become still. And in the quiet, I found what we lost." She folded the letter, kissed it, lit it in the fire. Ash rose like snow in reverse. They took one final trip to the city. Just once. To sign papers. Elise wore a scarf. Liliana carried her pine cone. Jack kept his eyes on everything. They walked into the firm Elise had built. She handed over the keys, the power, the name, to a woman she had mentored long ago. A woman who had stayed kind when the world tried to shape her otherwise. "Take care of it," Elise said. "I will," the woman replied. Liliana handed her the letterbox. "For you," she whispered. They returned to the woods by dusk. Elise stood at the cabin's threshold and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Jack took her hand. No words. Only warmth. Only belonging. The days slowed again. Liliana grew freckles from sunlight and time. Jack started building a greenhouse. Elise planted tulips beside the porch. They added a second bedroom to the cabin, then a third, not because they needed more space, but because love, like light, needs room to stretch. One night, Liliana asked Elise if she was her mom now. Elise hesitated, then said, "Not the one you were born with." She pulled Liliana close. "But maybe the one you found." Liliana nodded against her chest. That was enough. The gold pin stayed in a drawer for years, until the day Liliana graduated high school. Then Elise wrapped it in soft cloth, placed it in Liliana's hand, and said, "You start your story now." Liliana didn't cry, but Jack did, just a little, behind his coffee cup. Years passed. Seasons turned, but the bench under the pine never changed. Sometimes it held 2 people, sometimes 3, sometimes only 1 with a memory beside them. They didn't chase more than what they had, because what they had was enough. And on a quiet morning, when the snow came softly again, Elise sat with Jack, their fingers intertwined. She whispered, "This time they can't take anything." He kissed her temple and said they never could. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.